My name is Sarah Bradley. I'm the follow-up supervisor for the New York State Newborn Screening Program. And today, Kathy Chow and I are going to be presenting to you on our efforts to establish a long-term follow-up program and patient registry for the inherited metabolic disorders. So today, we're going to be just quickly reviewing how newborn screening works and how follow-up works in New York State and the role of our specialty care centers. And then we'll go through information about our long-term follow-up program, the structure of it, the timeline, some challenges that we have come across, and some solutions that we have put together, and also, of course, talk about our partnership with NBS-TRN. So in New York State, newborn screening is mandated by public health law, and we screen approximately 230,000 babies per year. And of those babies, about 3% have an abnormal screen that is either what we consider presumptive positive, which for us means borderline, or at the referral level. We test for 50 conditions right now on our main newborn screening panel, and in New York, there's no fee for our test. When we refer to follow-up, what we mean is that these are the actions that are taken by newborn screening staff, but also newborn screening stakeholders to ensure that babies that have positive results receive appropriate follow-up, appropriate repeat screening if that's necessary, a diagnostic workup and or evaluation. Our lab staff notifies us in the follow-up unit when there are abnormal results, and then we are then reporting those out to the baby's primary care provider and the closest specialist that's appropriate for whatever the disorder is. Our follow-up unit consists of, I believe it's 6 FTEs, but that is split out into 3 genetic counselors, 1 public health rep, 1.5 assistant research scientists, 1 research scientist, and 0.5 data administrators. And this is just a general overview of what our follow-up process looks like. Initially, we make a referral. So we're notified of the lab of the abnormal result. Our staff then notifies the baby's pediatrician as well as the nearest specialist for that family. Ideally, we hope that the pediatrician and the specialist talk with each other, and then one or both of them will speak with the parents about that result and then schedule the family to come in for an appropriate evaluation. And then once they determine what that child's diagnosis is, whether the baby has the disease or not, we ask that they report that outcome back to us. This all relies on close relationships with our specialists. And so a specialist is a medical provider that has clinical expertise in the specific condition that the baby is positive for. So we have them for we have many groups of specialists we work with. We work with immunologists, we work with metabolic geneticists, hematologist, endocrinologist, pulmonologist. So there's many different groups that we work with. Their role is to assess the baby's condition. They order the appropriate independent testing. They also will provide counseling to the family and try to determine what will be the diagnostic outcome from the baby. And then in most cases, the babies will stay with them if they're positive and if they have the disease, the baby will continue to follow with that specialist to receive treatment and to further manage their condition. So an important component is that we ask the specialist to report back to us the outcome of the baby. This is an example of a diagnosis form that we use to ask for that feedback from the specialist. Right now, it's a form that's printed and mailed to them or faxed to them. We're working on a system that they would be able to report back to us electronically. That's been a very long process that I won't go into too much detail about, but when they send this form back to us, we ask them to not only let us know the baby's diagnosis and if there was any previous family history, but we also want them to include the results of any independent testing that the baby may have had done, such as like an acylcarnitine profile, urine organic acids, but any type of testing that may have been done. So we consider short-term follow-up to finish when the specialist reports the outcome of the case to us. So short-term follow-up encompasses the time from when we in follow-up are notified of the result from the lab to when we notify the specialist. the baby is seen, and we find out the outcome of whether the baby had the disease or not. On our end, once we find out the outcome of the case after that short-term follow-up period ends, we close the case in our LIMS system using descriptive diagnosis codes that are based on case definitions. And again, we use that diagnosis form and independent testing results to determine that. Our goal is to ideally close all of our inherited metabolic disease cases and really all of our cases within 90 days from the initial referral. Um, and once the cases are closed, the cases are reviewed by laboratory staff just to make sure that the results seem like they make sense given the original newborn screening result. It's sort of like a measure of quality, kind of a quality control measure. This is just to help you visualize where our specialty care centers for. This is specifically those for the inherited metabolic diseases. So we have 10 of those centers, and they're spread throughout New York State, but you can see that there are large swaths of the state in the northern part of the state, where generally the population is more sparse, but we don't have like very close geographic coverage there. But down in the New York City area, you can see we have quite a lot of coverage down there. So like I said, we have 10 inherited metabolic specialty care centers. All of our specialty care centers are certified by our program. That certification process helps to ensure that they have the right resources to be able to appropriately follow up on those babies that they see. Our program, unlike some, does not provide direct funding or contracts for the provision of short-term follow-up services. There are some challenges faced by this group, and particularly with the inherited metabolic centers, and that is that just in general, there is a shortage of geneticists, and oftentimes they may not have a lot of support from their institutions to support their just their programs in general, but specifically newborn screening. Also, as I pointed out, some of them will have quite large geographic coverage areas, and that can present challenges too. But in general, a very key component of the success of our newborn screening follow-up, both short and long-term, is that we have strong partnerships with our specialists. And so that has been key to our short-term follow-up success, but also has been critical to our being able to establish long-term follow-up. So what long-term follow-up is, it's basically the assessment of what happens to those babies after they are found to have those diseases identified through short-term follow-up. It can be a helpful way, long-term follow-up can be a helpful way of demonstrating the effectiveness and the impact of newborn screening. So long-term follow-up involves a lot of data collection, finding out, again, what happened, looking at medical records, what happened to those babies. For it to be successful, it's very important to have buy-in from clinical stakeholders, which in this case are our specialists. It differs, long-term follow-up, the structure of it differs from newborn screening program to newborn screening program. And a big determination of that is, does their IRB require them to have approval for long-term follow-up? Is it like outside of the scope of their typical newborn screening? So in New York State, our IRB determined when we approached them many years ago about wanting to start long-term follow-up that this was kind of beyond the scope of our typical newborn screening program. And so they said that their guidance was that we should set it up as a consented registry, and so that we would have to have IRB approval. And our initial IRB approval came in 2016. And our basic structure and who was eligible was that it was any children from 2016 onward that had a confirmed or possible diagnosis of a fatty acid oxidation disorder, X-linked adrenoleukodystrophy, Pompe disease, or Krabbe disease. The parents had to provide consent, and then the participants would then be enrolled in the registry until age 18. And at that point, they would be given the option to reconsent to continue in the registry. So our recruitment sites for long-term follow-up are our 10 metabolic specialty care centers. And the structure is just that the specialty care staff would approach the families with the confirmed diseases at a time that they felt was best for the family. And so they would approach the families to consent to join the registry. And then the SCC staff would be the ones to enter the data, but the specialty care center staff could also query the database for their own research purposes. So we've had a lot of discussions over the years, but particularly in the beginning stages with the specialty care centers about how this would be structured and how the data would be entered, where would the data be entered. We discussed many different options for databases. Would we have one that we would maintain here at the Department of Health? We looked, there were options through different kind of pharmaceutical companies even. And after weighing the pros and cons of creating our own versus using an existing one, it was clear that the best option was to use NBS TRN's REDCap database. And so our intention for data collection is that the specialty care center staff will collect data on the registry participants and enter it in the database on an annual basis. We've also discussed the possibility of newborn screening staff doing that data abstraction, but we have staffing limitations for that currently. Just an example of some of the data elements that we're collecting, it includes just basic demographic information like education and development, hospitalizations for the child, socioeconomic factors for that family, and then also disease-specific information like the family's ethnicity, the family history, any clinical symptoms that the child has had, diagnostic data, the treatment type if they're receiving treatment, results of imaging studies, lab work, growth parameters, etc. So this is an example of what the sample size could look like for the study. So these are the numbers of children diagnosed with either a fatty acid oxidation disorder, Krabbe disease, Pompe, or XALD in 2018 and 2019. So 51 the first year, 43 the second year. So those would be potentially the amount of eligible patients per year for the registry. Though based on the experience of other newborn screening programs, we expected the actual enrollment to be less than 50%. So in actuality, so this is what our timeline has looked like with newborn, with long-term follow-up. So in 2012 is when we started to try to establish it and began early discussions. In 2016 is when we received our IRB approval. And then we had to get IRB approval at all of the 10 specialty care centers, which was definitely a challenge. So they could either sign an individual authorization agreement with our IRB, or they could put it through their own IRB. So in 2016, two of them discussed with their IRBs and signed an authorization agreement with our New York State IRB. And in 2017, one more came on board through that same mechanism. And so we had 3 out of 10 on board. By 2019, with 3 out of 10 recruitment sites active, we had enrolled 6 participants in the registry. And then Kathy will talk more about, we were able to establish some funding contracts, which started in October of 2019. And then as everybody knows, in the spring of 2020 is when the COVID pandemic hit. And that had impacts on us. So our IRB instituted a pause for all non-COVID related research studies, and that lasted for about 6 months. So that delayed IRB approvals at all of our recruitment sites, and no recruitment was allowed to happen during that time. Also during that time, our specialty care centers shifted many of their patient visits to telehealth. And so we amended our IRB protocol to allow for consenting to be done via a HIPAA compliant telehealth platform. But overall, some of the challenges that we have faced in trying to set up this long-term follow-up infrastructure was that our IRB initially determined that this had to be a full board, had to go for a full board IRB approval after to complete the long-term follow-up because it was viewed to be outside of the realm of our regular newborn screening operations. So also the participation of our specialty care centers is entirely voluntary. So there had been no incentives for the specialty care centers to go through the IRB approval process, which can be quite onerous. also to consent patients and provide data. We already know that they have staffing challenges. And by 2019, only 3 out of the 10 specialty care centers had gotten that IRB approval. And by 2019, we only had 6 subjects accrued. And actually, those had all come from one of the 10 recruitment sites, even though there were 2 others that could have been recruiting. And we had, at that point, no clinical outcome data had been entered. And so now Kathy will talk about how we address these challenges.
Thank you, Sarah, for the nice overview of our long-term follow-up registry. My name is Kathy Chow. I'm the Director of External Systems Quality Unit in the New York State Newborn Screening Program. So I will share the challenges we faced and the changes we made to improve our long-term follow-up program. So in 2019, our team set a goal. We want to improve clinical site participation rate. Special thanks to the New Steps CQI team to share all the resources and CQI tools. Many of you are familiar with the Plan, Do, Study, Act PDSA cycle, also known as the Deming Wheel. So we applied it during the planning phase and came up with a set of questions to address. So why don't the site participate? And it's likely lack of resources to go through IRB approval process, and they might need dedicated staff time. But what changes can we make? Is it possible for us to provide some sort of incentives? And how long will it take to see any improvement or no improvement? So we were fortunate enough to secure state funding to support the 10 clinical sites for 3 years, starting October 2019. So the funding is for salary only, and each team has to have a designated study coordinator. And the funding can only be used to support partial staff time to obtain IRB approval and to provide data. So 18 months later, even with the impact of COVID-19, IRB approvals from all 10 clinical sites were obtained in 2021. Big kudos to all the site coordinators and medical directors to achieve this milestone. On the other hand, we also saw limited progress on enrollment and data collection. So since the contract started, there was only 1 subject recruited, and so overall low enrollment number. But we noticed there are 3 clinical sites created user account in NBSTRN's LPDR site, and 1 case was partially entered. So the limited progress could be due to limited eligibility criteria for long-term follow-up registry. We know approximately 45 newborns per year are eligible to enroll. And based on the literature, we also know less than 50% are likely to consent. So in the best case of scenario, we could have 20 enrollment per year. And in addition, during the consenting process, there could be language and cultural barriers for families to consent and enroll in the registry. And the purpose of the registry and long-term follow-up might not be well understood by families and parents. We also heard from the clinical staff that they need help to navigate through the LPDR to create accounts and to enter data. And there is the standard data set in LPDR, but we can also work with NBSTRN to customize the fields to reflect the feedback from clinical sites. In addition, we also need to think about how to set outcome measures for the data collection in terms of completeness and accuracy of the information provided. Our long-term goal is to be able to share aggregated data to facilitate new knowledge discovery for effective treatments and best practices. So before we can move forward effectively, we also need to recognize what are our limitations. So since the pandemic starts, we have lost 3 staff who could possibly help with long-term follow-up efforts. and existing staff have responsibilities related to daily program operations, and it is clear to us that we need dedicated staff for long-term follow-up. And we also need resources to develop educational materials and translation services. We are actively seeking out solutions to address these limitations to create a sustainable quality long-term follow-up program. For the next PDSA cycle for continuous quality improvement, we plan to expand the eligibility criteria to include all IMD disorders and develop and expand educational resources for families to better understand the condition and the importance of long-term follow-up, and translate consent forms and educational materials into multiple languages. And we also hope we can connect families with support services. In terms of long-term follow-up data collection, we definitely need to work on improving our user experience and address questions from clinical staff by providing training and one-on-one troubleshooting sessions. And we will coordinate the inputs from the specialty care centers with NBSTRN to customize the data elements and longitudinal activities for different disorders. And our plan is to continue to partner with NBSTRN to design the output reports with measures for evaluations of our long-term follow-up data collection efforts. So we want to thank all the people who made our long-term follow-up registry possible. It takes teamwork, time, and resources to get the project going and to get momentum to make it successful and sustainable in the long run. Here is our contact information. Thank you.